The peaceful small-town setting Westfield, a quaint little town nestled in the picturesque landscape of Vermont, felt like a place lost in time. It sat cradled between rolling green hills during the warm months and snow-blanketed fields come winter. The town was the epitome of rural New England charm, with its white-steepled church, a single main street lined with mom-and-pop diners, a post office, and a general store where the cashier often doubled as the town's unofficial source of all breaking gossip. Everyone knew everyone here, and outsiders were as noticeable as a fox mistaking its way into a chicken coop. Life here moved at an unhurried pace. Mornings were marked by the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the streets and the soft chatter of the older folks gathering at Sally's diner. Evenings brought with them the amber hues of sunsets that seemed almost painted onto the horizon, where kids would pedal their bikes home, and porch lights blinked on like stars descending to earth. There was safety and predictability. The predictable sound of the town clock chiming every hour, and the comforting predictability of Farmer Henry's rooster crowing just a bit earlier than the sun every morning. Westfield wasn't just a town, it was a community where everyone knew each other. The Turner family ran the apple orchards, a staple of the town's identity for decades. Fall festivals revolved around their sweet cider and homemade pies. Down the road, old Mr. Jenkins crafted hand-carved furniture in his barn, a skill passed down through 3 generations. If you found yourself sitting on one of his chairs, you knew it came with the weight of history and care. But what truly set Westfield apart wasn't just its postcard-perfect scenery or its tight-knit community, it was the silence. The kind of silence where you could hear the rustling of deer in the nearby woods, or the gentle creaking of tree branches against the northern breeze. A peaceful silence. A silence that soothed the soul. Yet, beneath that serene quiet, lay the whispers of unspoken stories, the kind that only towns this small and this old harbor. The kind of town where secrets were hidden beneath layers of politeness, only to bubble up when no one expected them. When that silence was disturbed, the very fabric of this cozy tapestry unraveled. And so it came to pass, on a frosty winter morning that began in the same quiet way all others had, the town of Westfield was pulled abruptly into an unsettling reality. The air, though crisp and invigorating, carried with it an edge, an intangible tension. The tranquility shattered like glass hitting the frozen ground, as the town's serenity dimmed under a shadow they never could have anticipated. The first discovery. February 3rd, 2023, started just like any other winter morning in Westfield. A blanket of fresh snow had fallen the night before, leaving the streets and rooftops coated in a pristine white layer that sparkled under the pale morning sun. Smoke curled up from chimneys, and the town buzzed with its usual quiet energy. David Smith was shoveling his driveway, kids were bundling off to school with scarves as thick as blankets, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from Sally's diner, pulling in the early risers. But something about Mary Green's house struck David as off. Mary was a creature of habit, a 43-year-old widow best known for her warm laugh and fiercely independent nature. She lived modestly with her 2-year-old grandson in a cozy white cottage just across the street from David's home. Every single morning, like clockwork, David would see Mary at her kitchen window, lifting the curtains to let the sunlight pour in. When the curtains stayed closed that morning, he figured she might just be sleeping in. But then he noticed something else. Her car was still in the driveway, her morning paper untouched on the porch steps, and not even the faintest noise of life seeped out from the usually vibrant home. David tried to shake it off. People have off days, right? Maybe Mary wasn't feeling well. He told himself he was overthinking and went back to scraping the ice from his windshield. Yet, as the hours passed, and her house remained eerily still, the gnawing sense that something was wrong only grew stronger. David's unease eventually led him to cross the street and knock on Mary's door, calling her name. "Mary? Hey, it's David. Everything okay in there?" No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. When there was still no response, David's heart began to pound. He cupped his hands around his face and peered into one of the windows. The curtains made it impossible to see much, but the darkness inside seemed unnatural. It wasn't the kind of quiet you'd expect from a family just going about their day. It felt oppressive, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. By now, other neighbors started to notice David pacing nervously by the door. Mrs. Carter from 2 houses down came over, her arms full of groceries. "Something wrong, David?" she asked, glancing at Mary's house. David hesitated before answering, reluctant to jump to conclusions. I don't know. She's not answering. Her car's still here. It's not like her. After some deliberation, they decided it was time to call the police. Within half an hour, the familiar blue and white cruiser finally pulled up, with Officer Jim Matthews, a local cop of 20 years, stepping out and tipping his hat to the gathering neighbors. Jim was a comforting presence in the town, someone who exuded calm, no matter the situation. "All right, folks," he said, gently dispersing the small crowd that had formed. "Let me check things out." With David's help, Jim managed to pry open the back door after receiving no response from inside. The moment he stepped in, the sharp chill of the February air seemed to intensify, but it wasn't the cold that made his stomach lurch. It was the unnatural quiet that enveloped the house, stark and unnerving, like the calm before a storm. Jim called out, "Mary, it's Officer Matthews, just stopping by to check on you." Still, nothing. As he slowly moved through the house, the tidy, undisturbed furniture only made the silence more sinister. Then he reached the hallway leading to the bedroom door. He paused for a brief second, his gut tightening. There were faint scuff marks on the floorboards, marks that seemed out of place in an otherwise pristine house. When Jim pushed open the door to Mary's bedroom, the sight before him froze him in place. Mary Green's lifeless body lay sprawled across the bed, her grandson beside her, equally still. Blood painted chilling streaks across the room, sharp and jagged like the remnants of a violent hurricane. Jim wasn't one to lose his composure, but even a seasoned officer like him couldn't help but feel the weight of the gruesome scene before him. He immediately radioed for backup, his voice thick with urgency. "This is Officer Matthews. We need detectives and a forensics team at 245 Maple Street. Possible double homicide. Immediate response required." As his radio crackled back with confirmation, Jim couldn't shake the eerie silence of the house. The town of Westfield, nestled in its blanket of snow and small-town charm, had just been rocked to its core. What followed that morning was unlike anything the tight-knit community had ever witnessed. Police tapes soon cordoned off Mary's property as forensic teams examined every corner of the house. Word spread like wildfire throughout the town, and whispers of Mary Green and murder floated on the frigid air, sending chills down the spine of everyone who heard it. For a town where the most exciting piece of gossip was Sally's burnt blueberry pie last summer, the tragic discovery at Mary's home was unthinkable, an ugly intrusion into their tranquil lives. The scene full of clues. The scene inside Mary Green's cozy cottage was nothing short of chilling, a stark contrast to the snow-blanketed New England charm surrounding her home. Investigators arrived quickly after Officer Matthews' urgent call, their boots crunching the frozen snow as they approached the house with the solemn understanding that this wasn't going to be just another routine day in sleepy Westfield. Forensic teams began their work immediately, carefully navigating the house to preserve every shred of evidence. They started in Mary's bedroom, the atmospheric heart of the crime scene, where the meticulous chaos of violence seemed oddly juxtaposed with the traces of a once-happy living space. Family photos adorned the walls, images of Mary laughing beside her daughter or sitting in her garden with her grandson on her lap. But today, those memories hung in stark opposition to the violence that had unfolded. The blood spatter told a haunting story, one that only science could unravel. Trajectories, angles, the force, it was all there on the walls, carpets, and furniture. The patterns revealed signs of a struggle, one that began at the bedroom's entrance and ended near the bed. A crimson smear on the doorframe suggested Mary had tried to brace herself in sheer desperation, leaving behind evidence of her final moments of resistance. Beyond the gruesome blood trails, other unsettling signs illuminated the devastating events of that night. There on the nightstand sat a half-drunk cup of tea and an open paperback novel, a snapshot of a quiet evening interrupted too soon. One of the detectives, Rachel Simmons, noted how personal the space felt. "She probably didn't see it coming," she murmured, her voice low and tinged with empathy. On the floor near the bed, investigators discovered a broken lamp with shards scattered unnaturally across the room. It wasn't just tossed aside. It had been used, likely as a weapon, based on the jagged edges stained with blood. The dresser drawers had been left ajar but barely rummaged through, perhaps in a hurried attempt to stage a robbery. Officer Matthews shook his head at the haphazard scene. "This wasn't theft, it wasn't about money," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The toddler bed in the corner of the room was a gut punch for every officer on site. Tiny stuffed animals sat in eerie silence, untouched by the carnage except for a single drop of blood that had seeped into the blanket. Beside it, faint scuff marks on the floor almost went unnoticed until one observant forensics tech crouched down. The scratches looked deliberate, as though something heavy had been moved, a desperate act to conceal something underneath. Sure enough, when the blanket was pulled back, revealed beneath was what seemed to be a misplaced jewelry box. Inside were Mary's modest treasures, a few rings, an engraved locket, and a piece of paper with a note scrawled in hurried handwriting. The note startled everyone the moment it was read: "If something happens, trust no one." This cryptic clue led to even more questions rather than answers. Investigators couldn't determine whether Mary had left that note for someone else, or if it was a message written well before the night of her death, tied to a growing paranoia she seemingly kept hidden. The sharpest piece of evidence, however, came from the back door. It appeared to have been pried open, likely at the hands of someone who knew what they were doing. Steel tools had been used to avoid damaging the visible lock, leaving clean but detectable marks on the frame. The lack of snow disturbance outside suggested the break-in hadn't occurred that morning but rather the night before, during the heaviest snowfall. In the living room, investigators found further inconsistencies. A clock knocked off its shelf, a wine glass tipped over, and crumbs scattered on the coffee table like someone had intruded mid-evening, long before Mary had settled into bed. It was more than what could be brushed off as coincidence. A timeline was slowly coming together. Detective Simmons, ever detail-oriented, combed through a hallway closet and discovered an oddity. Tucked deep beneath stacks of linens was a men's jacket, worn and patched in several places, marked with a faded logo from a construction company out of town. To her knowledge, Mary had no male relatives nearby, leading Simmons to suspect that whoever owned the jacket might have been tied to her recent routines. Every corner of the house whispered clues, though many in hushed tones. In the bathroom, drops of water inside the sink didn't appear to match the current temperature in the room. "He washed up," Simmons confirmed to the team. "He cleaned his hands, maybe his weapon." It was as though the intruder left deliberately calculated disturbances, just enough to hint at intention while trying to wipe away incriminating evidence. Outside, a new set of challenges awaited. Fresh tire tracks leading away from the road seemed to vanish as abruptly as they started, either covered by the heavy snow or wiped by the perp to avoid pursuit. Neighbors swore they'd heard and seen nothing suspicious despite piecing together lingering memories of bumps in the night that they had chalked up to weather or animals. By the time they finished collecting evidence from the house, the air inside felt heavier, not just from the lingering scent of copper and despair, but from the understanding that this crime wasn't random. It had precision, familiarity, and intent pouring out from every clue left behind. Simmons was sure of one thing, as the forensic techs packed up their kits. The killer was either someone close to Mary or a stranger who took the time to study her life in excruciating detail. The trail of clues. The once sleepy town of Westfield was now awakening to a grim new reality as the murder of Mary Green and her grandson left the community shaken. For officers Jim Matthews and Detective Rachel Simmons, this wasn't just another case, it was personal. Mary Green wasn't just a nameless victim who lived somewhere off a bustling highway. She was the heart of this town, a woman whose warm smile and kind gestures had touched everyone she met. To those investigating, she wasn't another file sitting on an office desk. Solving her case became a mission. The investigation began with the evidence collected on the scene: the cryptic note, the blood-stained room, the jacket in the closet, and the signs of a break-in. Every piece spoke to an unnerving narrative of premeditated violence, but none of them directly pointed to the perpetrator. "We need to dig deeper," Simmons said after an exhaustive analysis of preliminary findings. "Who left that note? Why wasn't anything stolen if this was a break-in? And that men's jacket, that's not coincidence." The note especially became the immediate focus. "If something happens, trust no one." Who was Mary warning about? Her message felt heavy with foreboding, yet frustratingly vague. Simmons began her days working backward from the note, speaking to townsfolk who had interacted with Mary in the weeks leading up to her death. Had she mentioned feeling uneasy? Had anyone suspicious been lurking in her life? Neighbor after neighbor described Mary as the same kind-hearted woman, no paranoia, no unusual visitors, no visible fear. But as Simmons delved deeper, a pattern began to emerge. One name popped up in conversations: Jeffrey "Rusty" Miller. He was described as a local oddball who had recently been seen visiting Mary's home. Though he called himself a friendly junk dealer, Jeffrey rarely smiled and was known for showing up uninvited, pestering folks to sell their unused items. "I've seen him round Mary's place," David Smith said when Simmons knocked on his door. "Didn't think anything of it at first, but he's not exactly the chatty neighbor type, you know. always lurking, kind of pushy. Jeffrey Miller had lived in the neighboring town of Shelby, only 20 minutes away, but he was no stranger to Westfield. Reports came in of him constantly probing homeowners for old furniture, small appliances, or antiques. It was unclear how he knew Mary and why he'd been visiting her, but chance encounters painted a picture of a somewhat domineering man whose charm was more uneasy than endearing. The men's jacket found in Mary's closet became the next central clue. Faded and stitched with a logo from a now-defunct Shelby construction company, it was an unusual find for someone like Mary. No male relatives seemed to match the description of the jacket's size or style, nor could anyone recollect any construction in her house. But Simmons followed the thread, connecting the logo back to Joseph Miller Construction, a small business that had collapsed into bankruptcy 6 years earlier. Its owner? Jeffrey Miller. As the investigation dug further into Jeffrey's life, darker truths began to surface. Jeffrey's record wasn't spotless. Though he had never been convicted of a violent crime, his temper was well documented. A history of small-town squabbles, unpaid debts, and escalating disputes painted him as a man often teetering on the edge of control. Simmons and Matthews began piecing a working theory together. Jeffrey had entered Mary's life under the guise of neighborly helpfulness or perhaps friendly business, but their relationship soured for reasons unknown. Was it unrequited feelings? Business gone wrong? Or was it something buried even deeper? Police obtained a warrant to search Jeffrey's small trailer, tucked away on a scraggly patch of land off Route 12. Inside, officers found a jumbled mess that spoke to a chaotic, transient existence. Half-packed boxes, piles of mismatched tools, and stacks of what some might call junk. Old clocks, rusty picture frames, nameplates from long-lost pianos. One pile in particular drew attention: children's toys. Though initially dismissed as innocent leftovers from yard sales, the toys felt eerily reminiscent of the ones seen in Mary's home for her grandson. And hidden beneath these toys, Simmons uncovered something more sinister: an old hunting knife, smudged with what appeared to be dried blood, hastily wrapped in an oily rag. Testing would confirm that the blood matched Mary and her grandson, but uncovering this evidence wasn't enough. Investigators wanted more direct ties to the night of the murders. That's when they uncovered a link they hadn't expected: 6 unsolved disappearances from neighboring counties. Every missing person had either been seen interacting with Jeffrey, or had crossed paths with his junk trading business. Back in Westfield, Simmons revisited how Jeffrey frequented Mary's home. Neighbors noticed his truck parked outside at odd times, and mentioned hearing heated arguments on occasion. "I thought they were fighting over money," Mrs. Carter offered. "She didn't seem to have an inch of patience for him the last time I saw." When Jeffrey caught wind that police were now actively searching for him and connecting dots he thought would remain buried, he disappeared. His cell phone went silent, his trailer abandoned. He became the focus of a national manhunt. Painstakingly, investigators pieced together Jeffrey's movements from gas station CCTV footage, tips from truck drivers, and scattered reports of suspicious sightings. He'd slipped through a dozen small towns as though he were a ghost, doubling back and using the wilderness to stay off the grid. Simmons had one growing fear simmering under her otherwise determined exterior. If they didn't catch him soon, Jeffrey "Rusty" Miller would disappear forever, along with whatever justice Mary Green deserved. A series of serial murders. The investigation into Mary Green's tragic death was already shaping up to be the most horrifying case Westfield had ever known. But what investigators soon unraveled went beyond anything they could have imagined. What seemed like a single, isolated incident began to expose a far more sinister story. A dark tale that stretched across state lines and traced back to a man who had been operating under their noses for years. It all started when detectives received a chilling report on February 10, 2023. A group of hikers near an abandoned warehouse just 20 miles from Westfield stumbled across something that made their blood run cold. 6 bodies buried in shallow graves inside the decaying structure. The hikers, initially venturing out to photograph the snow-covered countryside, had wandered into the eerie, crumbling remains of the warehouse when one of them spotted something partially buried, a pale, lifeless hand jutting out from the dirt. Panic set in, and within the hour the area was swarming with police and forensic teams. The warehouse itself, as investigators soon discovered, was no random site. It was registered to none other than Jeffrey Miller, the same man they were desperately tracking in connection to Mary Green's murder. Skeletal beams creaked ominously overhead as detectives descended into the dark, cold bowels of the structure to survey the graves. The victims, all adults, had been brutally killed with the same method: blunt force trauma, and deep stab wounds. This wasn't a quick crime of passion, it was cold, calculated, and methodical. Each victim had something in common with Jeffrey Miller. They were all former employees at his now-defunct construction company, Joseph Miller Construction, legacies of a business that fell apart amid fraud allegations and unpaid wages years earlier. Investigators took a grim inventory of Jeffrey's past employees, trying to match the bodies to missing persons reports filed in the area. Though official identities took days to confirm, it became clear the killer had been systematically silencing those he may have blamed for his downfall. Detective Rachel Simmons was unnerved by how personal these murders felt. "This wasn't random," she told Officer Matthews as they stared down at the freshly uncovered graves. "These people, these bodies, they meant something to him, or at least they represented something hateful. Anger, revenge." Word of the discovery shattered any lingering sense of safety in Westfield and beyond. It wasn't just the Green family that had been targeted. This was part of a larger, coordinated spree of violence that dated back years. With Mary and her grandson added to the list, it became chillingly evident that Jeffrey wasn't just some drifter who snapped one day, he was a serial killer. Inside the warehouse, clues painted an even darker picture. There were tools scattered across dusty workbenches, rusty saws, hammers, and crowbars, all of which had been turned into makeshift weapons at some point. Dried blood still clung to some of them. An old chalkboard that once displayed work schedules hung eerily in the corner. Now, scratched into its surface, investigators found a list of names, many of which matched the victims in the graves. Other names on the list were circled, targets Jeffrey hadn't hunted down yet. Simmons and her team were struck by the organized chaos of the scene. The killings weren't just acts of rage, they were deliberate acts of control. Jeffrey seemed to have chosen the warehouse as a place where he could carefully dispose of his victims and leave no witnesses behind. The thought chilled Simmons to her core. This man isn't rushing, he's calculating, planning. That makes him even more dangerous. More damning evidence was uncovered in Jeffrey's lair of carnage. Receipts from local supply stores indicated he'd been purchasing shovels, tarps, and industrial bags over the years. DNA evidence on several tools matched his fingerprints. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all was a crumpled logbook found in the corner of an office. It listed not only the dates of the killings but cryptic notes next to each name: traitor, the debt collector, the thief. These weren't just his victims. These were people he specifically sought to punish, in his mind, for wronging him. The forensic teams determined the murders spanned at least 6 years, yet somehow, Jeffrey had evaded suspicion until now. The isolated warehouse became a perfect hiding spot for his crimes. A place no one visited, lost among woods and forgotten roads. It wasn't until his sloppier, more public murder of Mary Green that the trail began to lead directly back to him. The team pieced together a psychological profile of Jeffrey, a man who had watched his world crumble when his construction business went under. What should have remained a bad chapter of his life turned into a bitter vendetta. Evidence suggested his struggling mental state devolved into a dangerous pathology. Former employees who had spoken out against him, people who pursued overdue payments, these were the individuals who caught his wrath. But Mary Green? Her connection wasn't clear, leaving investigators with a gnawing realization. Even his choice of targets was evolving into something far more erratic and unpredictable. As the bodies were removed from the warehouse and word of this macabre discovery spread, it became a national news story. The community of Westfield became ground zero for a media frenzy. "Serial killer active near Westfield. Killer's revenge against former employees," screamed headlines. Towns that once hosted the calmest of lives were now teeming with reporters, broadcasting images of the barn, the graves, and local law enforcement scrambling to piece everything together. Perhaps the most haunting prospect of all was this: Jeffrey Miller was still out there. Somewhere in the cold expanse of rural countryside, or hidden deep in the heart of another unsuspecting town, he was moving, thinking, planning his next attack. For the men and women pursuing him, the race against time felt unbearably heavy. The discovery of 6 victims had cemented one undeniable conclusion. If Jeffrey wasn't stopped soon, there would be more graves, more grieving families, and another quiet community thrust into chaos. The dark motive behind. As the investigative team began peeling back layer after layer of Jeffrey Miller's life, the twisted puzzle of his dark motives began to take form. What they uncovered was a man whose life had unraveled in ways no one around him had fully understood. Those closest to him, friends, family, business partners, had either been pushed away by his behavior or had fallen victim to his rapid descent into darkness. Jeffrey Miller wasn't always the shadowy figure now dominating national headlines. There was a time when he was simply a family man, a husband, and the owner of a small construction company. Back in the late 2000s, Joseph Miller Construction served towns like Westfield and neighboring Shelby, building homes and repairing infrastructure in tight-knit communities that trusted local businesses. At first, Jeffrey thrived. His company was often praised for completing projects on time, hiring local workers and keeping prices fair. People trusted him. But cracks began to show around 2015. The company started faltering and whispers of unpaid wages and unfulfilled contracts rippled through the area. Subcontractors sued for non-payment and clients accused Jeffrey of cutting corners. It turned out that his financial mismanagement had left him drowning in debt. By the time it became public knowledge that Jeffrey had been collecting payment for projects he never intended to complete, Joseph Miller Construction was already bankrupt. Jeffrey lost everything, his reputation, his business, and, not long after, his family. His wife, Eleanor, filed for divorce not long after the construction company folded. It was said that she had endured years of emotional neglect. While Jeffrey obsessed over salvaging his failing business, Eleanor had been left to raise their 2 children alone. After the divorce was finalized, Eleanor moved to Pennsylvania to start a new chapter, cutting off almost all contact with Jeffrey. To him it wasn't just bankruptcy or divorce, Detective Simmons explained to Officer Jim Matthews late one night at the precinct. It was betrayal. He saw Eleanor leaving as her siding with the world against him. That was probably the moment when something inside him broke. But that wasn't all. Jeffrey's records showed he also spent years battling undiagnosed mental health issues, including severe paranoia and anger management problems. Former employees described his increasingly erratic behavior before the company's collapse, screaming fits over minor mistakes, his growing mistrust toward his workers, even accusations that people were out to get him. It became a vicious cycle. Financial failure fed his paranoia, and his paranoia destroyed everything else in its path. One chilling backstory emerged about a former employee, Alan Fisher, who had worked closely with Jeffrey in the company's final years. Fisher had been one of many employees at Joseph Miller Construction who hadn't been paid for months, and he eventually sued his boss for fraud. Several years later, Fisher mysteriously disappeared during an innocent road trip, only to have his name surface on the chalkboard list discovered in Jeffrey's warehouse. Investigators now believe Fisher was the first victim of Jeffrey's dark vendetta. The deeper detectives dug, the more they realized that Jeffrey's anger wasn't aimed at random strangers. His list of victims all seemed to be people he blamed for his failures, contractors who had sued him, employees who had abandoned him, clients who demanded refunds, and even acquaintances who gossiped about his ruined reputation. Jeffrey saw the world as divided into 2 camps, those who were loyal to him and those who had betrayed him, and in his eyes, betrayal demanded punishment. The case file began taking on a chilling narrative that revealed a pattern of escalating violence. After his divorce, Jeffrey retreated into isolation, living in a ramshackle trailer where neighbors described him as a ghost. He rarely spoke to anyone except to push his odd junk trading business, but behind closed doors, Jeffrey was spiraling. Financial records showed small purchases of alarming items, knives, locks, tarps, industrial chemicals, over the span of several years. To the untrained eye, they looked like supplies for an odd job or home repair. To Detective Simmons, they marked the supplies of a man plotting something horrific. But why Mary Green? That question unnerved Simmons more than any other. Mary didn't fit the profile of his other victims. She wasn't connected to his construction business and didn't seem to have crossed him in any way. As it turned out, the answer wasn't in Mary's life, but in Jeffrey's warped mind. According to neighbors, Jeffrey and Mary had begun crossing paths a few months before her death. He'd arrived unannounced at her home, offering to haul away junk from her garage. Though Mary was known for her warm and trusting nature, she only allowed Jeffrey to take small items, broken garden tools, an old chair or 2. But it seemed Jeffrey saw that kindness differently. Simmons speculated that in Jeffrey's paranoid mind, Mary's polite refusals might have felt like subtle rejections. Perhaps he saw her as yet another person underestimating or betraying him. The final trigger may have come through Mary's late daughter. Interviews with Mary's neighbors revealed that before her passing, her daughter had hired Jeffrey's company years ago for a home renovation project. Though the work had been completed, she'd reportedly confronted Jeffrey over subpar craftsmanship and delays. In Jeffrey's distorted world, that single confrontation might have festered into resentment, one that, years later, he redirected toward Mary. "He's not just killing for revenge," Simmons explained during a briefing with her team. "He's killing to rewrite his story. In his mind, every victim erases a piece of shame, a tiny piece of failure. It's about control. It's about saying, you don't get to look down on me, even after they're gone." But Jeffrey's vendetta wasn't just about personal slights. It became clear that at some point, he'd transitioned from a man seeking revenge to someone who enjoyed the power his crimes gave him. Each act of violence wasn't just about settling a score, it was about reaffirming his dominance. The logbook of cryptic notes, traitor, the debt collector, the meddler, spoke to a man who had turned human beings into caricatures of blame, each name a stand-in for the torment he claimed to have endured. In the end, Jeffrey Miller wasn't just battling external enemies, he was at war with himself. His victims became collateral damage in a dark, twisted mission to reclaim his own sense of worth. "There's no logic here," Simmons told Matthews after a long day of reviewing Jeffrey's frightening history. "Just a man so consumed with his own failures that he built a monstrous delusion to justify them." The more detectives discovered about Jeffrey's psyche, the more urgent the hunt for him became. He wasn't a man losing control, he was a man who had already lost control long ago. And as Simmons stared at the crumpled note in the evidence file that read, "If something happens, trust no one," she understood its full meaning. Mary Green somehow knew she had crossed paths with a man tormented by dangerous, unseen battles. Unfortunately, she had underestimated just how far Jeffrey Miller was willing to go to keep his delusions alive. A nationwide manhunt. By February 12, 2023, Jeffrey Miller wasn't just the most wanted man in Vermont, he was a fugitive of national significance. His face, marked by hollow eyes and a deep scowl etched with years of bitterness, was now plastered on every news station and across countless social media feeds. Wanted Jeffrey Miller became the haunting refrain of every news segment, alongside the chilling phrase, "suspected serial killer." The FBI had taken over the case by this point, turning what had started as a small-town murder investigation into a full-scale, nationwide manhunt. Law enforcement agencies from Maine to Alabama received bulletins with Jeffrey's photograph, physical description, and a warning, circled in bold red text. Extremely dangerous, violent tendencies. A $100,000 reward was announced for any tip leading to his capture. Major cities and rural communities alike were on high alert. For a man like Jeffrey, who had become skilled at vanishing into the shadows, the challenge was going to be finding him before he struck again. "Make no mistake," Detective Rachel Simmons told her Westfield team, as federal agents set up shop in their precinct. "This guy knows how to survive. He's been living on the fringes for years, off the grid, staying low, and moving silently. He's a ghost, but even ghosts leave footprints." That determination was shared among the FBI agents now coordinating multiple teams simultaneously. From tracking his digital footprint, limited as it was, to following up on a growing number of tips. Most of the tips, however, led to dead ends. At least a dozen sightings poured in daily. Drivers at truck stops claimed they'd seen him walking past their rigs at dawn. A gas station attendant in Massachusetts swore she'd sold him a can of gasoline, but security footage later proved it wasn't him. A man fitting his description was reported near a church in Maine, but by the time police arrived, no sign of Jeffrey remained. Each false lead deepened the pressure, making the entire manhunt feel like a needle in a haystack pursuit. What made the search even more frustrating was Jeffrey's apparent ability to evade technology. He carried no phone, used no credit cards, and made purchases in cash, traits that came naturally to a man who had spent years living on the edge of society. Simmons speculated that his experience as a junk trader had also made him unusually resourceful. "He probably knows every back road and shortcut from here to Canada," she told Officer Matthews during one late-night strategy session. "He's not someone who needs a GPS to disappear." On February 14th, a breakthrough finally came. Surveillance footage from a gas station in upstate New York captured a man fitting Jeffrey's description paying in cash for 2 bottles of water and a pack of beef jerky. He wore a tattered baseball cap, pulled low over his face, and an oversized jacket that obscured his frame. The footage was blurry, but investigators recognized the sharp jawline and hunched gait. It had to be Jeffrey. The gas station clerk, unaware of the danger, described the encounter as brief but unsettling. "He didn't say much, just gave me this look like I wasn't even there, paid exact change and left," the clerk recalled later to authorities. The sighting suggested he was heading south, possibly toward Pennsylvania or West Virginia, which sent law enforcement scrambling to tighten their net in that region. By February 15th, federal agents had zeroed in on a promising lead, a dilapidated hunting cabin deep in the woods of Alabama that had been purchased years ago under an alias traced back to Jeffrey. The tip came from an anonymous hiker who had spotted a suspicious figure near the area days prior, carrying what looked like a rifle and wearing layers of clothes far too warm for the mild southern winter. The cabin stood miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that twisted through dense forest. It was remote, quiet, and the perfect place for a fugitive to hide. In the early hours of February 16th, the FBI, accompanied by local law enforcement and 2 tactical SWAT teams, descended on the area. Undercover agents had scoured the surrounding woods overnight, moving slowly and methodically to confirm Jeffrey's presence without tipping him off. "If we rush this," the lead agent had insisted, "we risk him slipping away, or worse, retaliating." They had seen the bloodshed Jeffrey Miller was capable of, and no one wanted to give him even the slightest opening to lash out. As dawn broke over the misty forest, the serene landscape was shattered by the low hum of helicopters overhead and the crunch of boots on frost-covered leaves. The cabin came into view, a weathered structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof almost blending into the gray-brown trees around it. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, proof that someone was inside. The air grew thick with tension. "Eyes on the cabin!" an FBI sniper whispered over the radio, positioned in the trees roughly 200 yards away. "Confirmed heat signature inside. He's there." What followed was a tense standoff that would later make national headlines. Law enforcement surrounded the cabin, their voices amplified through a bullhorn. "Jeffrey Miller, this is the FBI. We know you're inside. Come out with your hands up." There was no response. The quiet stretched on for what felt like hours, but was only minutes. Agents exchanged uneasy glances, their fingers twitching near their weapons. Then there was movement. The door creaked open and a figure emerged, his hands raised in the cold morning air. It was Jeffrey. His face was sunken, his beard unkempt, and his clothes hung loosely from his gaunt frame, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, still burned fiercely. "Don't shoot," he muttered, slurring slightly as though the words tasted foreign to him. He took another step forward and for a moment the tension seemed to break, but then he stopped. His hands twitched. Agents shouted commands, "Stay where you are," but Jeffrey's gaze darted toward the tree line, calculating his options. In that split second, it became clear, he wasn't going to surrender without a fight. With startling speed, he darted back toward the cabin's door, but before he could disappear, a precise shot from the sniper team grazed his leg, sending him tumbling to the ground. SWAT officers swarmed him, pinning him down as he thrashed wildly, screaming a mix of obscenities and incoherent mutterings. When it was over, Jeffrey Miller was handcuffed, his breath ragged as agents hauled him to his feet. "It's what they all deserved," he spat through gritted teeth, his voice filled with venom. "You don't understand, the pain they caused me." The capture of Jeffrey Miller ended the largest manhunt in Vermont's history, a nationwide dragnet that spanned multiple states and brought together dozens of federal and local agencies. The case would dominate headlines for weeks to come, and though his arrest marked a moment of relief for Westfield and beyond, it was far from bringing true closure. For Detective Simmons and the families of his victims, the hardest questions still lingered. Why? How could it have come to this? The country had Jeffrey Miller in custody, but the scars of his crimes would linger for decades. What had once been a race to find a fugitive now moved to the courtroom where the gruesome details of his twisted motives would finally come to light. But for Simmons, one thing was clear. Justice had caught up to Jeffrey Miller. And though he had tried to disappear into the wilderness, he could no longer run from the monstrosities he'd left behind. The tense standoff. On February 16, 2023, as the first light of dawn filtered through the Alabama woods, law enforcement officers prepared for what would become one of the most harrowing moments of the nationwide hunt for Jeffrey Miller. After weeks of relentless pursuit, agents believed they had cornered him in a rundown hunting cabin nestled deep in the wilderness. This wasn't just the culmination of a multi-state manhunt for a fugitive. It was the moment when lives would be on the line, and the entire operation would hinge on a razor-thin edge between success and disaster. The air was thick with tension as federal agents, SWAT teams, and local officers encircled the cabin. The building looked almost as though it had grown out of the forest itself, abandoned by time, the wood darkened with rot, the roof sagging under years of weathered abuse. Yet, from the faint glow of smoke curling from the chimney, everyone knew someone was inside. FBI sniper units had positioned themselves in high perches among the trees, their scopes trained on the one-way in, one-way out structure. Tactical teams whispered instructions into their radios, calibrating their every move to minimize risk. Though the cabin was surrounded, nobody wanted to underestimate their target. Jeffrey Miller might have been a fugitive, but he was no ordinary criminal. Those investigating him had come to understand how calculated he was, how driven by some twisted internal logic. If he felt like he had nowhere to go, he could do something unimaginable, even take more lives in addition to his own. "Visual confirmed," murmured the sniper assigned to the overwatch position. His voice crackled low yet resolute over the radio. "One heat signature, stationary, appears armed." Detective Rachel Simmons adjusted her bulletproof vest as she stood at the outer perimeter of the law enforcement blockade. Though she wasn't part of the tactical operation itself, Simmons had spearheaded the entire investigation against Jeffrey from Westfield. She had tracked every dark clue and pieced together every horrifying detail of his crimes. It was only right, she thought, that her case drew to a close here. FBI agent Adam Carver, the man in charge of the standoff, addressed the team. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said grimly, his eyes scanning the cabin as if trying to will Jeffrey into surrendering, "we need this guy alive. We need to understand the extent of what he's done, who he's hurt, and who he planned to hurt next. But don't let your guard down for a second. He's smart, desperate, and, above all, dangerous." With the team ready to act, the bullhorn crackled in the cold morning air. A negotiator stepped forward, his voice amplified and unwavering. "Jeffrey Miller, this is the FBI. We know you're inside. The cabin is surrounded. Step out with your hands up." Silence. The negotiator repeated the command in a calm but commanding tone. "Jeffrey, we don't want to see anyone get hurt. Let's end this peacefully. Come out now, and we'll ensure your safety." Still nothing. Inside the house, that oppressive silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of a helicopter circling above. Simmons stood at the edge of the line, biting her lip. Every second that passed with no response from inside churned her stomach. She had come to recognize Jeffrey's capacity for deflection, for manipulation, but something about this moment felt different. It was as though he were weighing his options, deciding whether this would be the last stand of his life. Finally, a sound, faint and almost ghostly. The creak of floorboards from inside the cabin echoed through the clearing, followed by the slow scrape of metal against wood. Everyone froze, their fingers hovering over triggers, their breaths held in unison. The door creaked open. Jeffrey Miller stepped out into the pale morning light. His appearance was ghastly, his face gaunt, framed by a tangle of an unkempt beard. His hollowed eyes seemed to pierce everything they landed on, as though he were already several steps ahead of the officers before him. His hands were raised high, but his posture lacked the submission they had hoped for. It wasn't surrender, it was defiance. "Put your hands where we can see them!" barked one team member, his rifle trained steadily on Jeffrey's center mass. Jeffrey complied halfway but stopped midway down the steps of the wooden porch. His lips twitched into something unsettling between a sneer and a smirk. "So, this is it, huh?" he said, his voice raspy and venomous. "You think you've won?" "Jeffrey," the negotiator continued, keeping steady, "we need you to walk toward us. Slowly. No sudden movements." "I don't think so," Jeffrey hissed, his gaze darting toward the tree line. His movements slowed, calculated. Something about the way his weight shifted on his feet unsettled every officer on site. In that moment, everyone could read his body language, as though his mind had spun through its final options and landed on one last desperate plan. "Stay where you are!" shouted an agent, the urgency in his voice now unmistakable. But Jeffrey wasn't listening. In a flash, he lunged back toward the cabin's threshold, his body moving with startling speed for a man so disheveled. The moment hung suspended, as if the forest itself had held its breath. A split-second decision followed. A sniper's precise shot struck Jeffrey's leg, sending him toppling onto the wooden floorboards with a howl of anguish. Chaos erupted as SWAT teams rushed forward, their boots thundering against the hard-packed earth. Jeffrey thrashed on the ground, screaming obscenities and twisting like a feral animal trying to escape a cage. Officers swarmed him, pinning his wiry frame to the dirt, their shouts of "Hold him down!" blending with Jeffrey's guttural cries. When it was finally over, Jeffrey was cuffed and restrained, his face pressed to the ground as his ragged breaths clouded the cold morning air. Yet even in his subdued state, he looked over his shoulder with the same haunting defiance that had marked the standoff. Through gritted teeth he spat, It's what they deserved. You don't know. You don't understand. The forest that had served as Jeffrey Miller's hideout fell silent once again, save for the rustling of leaves as dawn broke fully over the horizon. Law enforcement officers stood in clusters, their breaths visible in the chill, murmuring both relief and disbelief. After weeks of terror and tragedy, the man who had eluded them was now in custody. Detective Simmons stepped forward cautiously, her hands trembling slightly as she watched Jeffrey being hauled to his feet. His mutterings grew quieter, but the venom lingered in every word. Simmons didn't need to hear what he was saying. She already knew the depth of the darkness inside him. As Jeffrey was loaded into a convoy vehicle, Simmons found herself wrestling with two competing emotions: the relief that he was finally captured, and the weight of knowing his crimes would forever leave scars on so many lives. The standoff marked the end of the longest manhunt in Vermont's recent history. Yet for the families mourning loved ones and the community forever scarred, this chapter of justice felt only like the beginning. The courtroom battles, the revelations of horrors yet untold, and the long path toward closure were still to come. But for now, as law enforcement agents packed up their gear and began winding their way out of the forest, one thing was certain: Jeffrey Miller, the menace of Westfield, would never again disappear into the shadows. The confession and horrific crimes. At the Westfield Police Department, under the dim artificial light of an anonymous interrogation room, the killer sat in an unsettling silence. His name was now infamous: Jeffrey Miller. The man who had terrorized small towns and left a trail of blood-soaked chaos across multiple states was finally in custody. Despite being cuffed and surrounded by officers, Jeffrey exuded a chilling aura of control, his hollow eyes scanning the room as if he were the one in charge of the situation. Detective Rachel Simmons adjusted her chair directly across from him, her expression a carefully measured mix of calm and determination. This wasn't her first interrogation, but something about sitting so close to Jeffrey set her teeth on edge. His physical presence wasn't imposing, his thin frame and sunken features were hardly intimidating, but the weight of everything he had done loomed heavy in the air. The room seemed colder because of him. "Jeffrey Miller," Simmons began, her voice unwavering, "you need to understand something. We already have enough evidence to convict you. The bodies, the DNA, the weapons, there's no way out. But this is your chance to tell your story, to explain yourself, why you did it, who else might still be out there." Jeffrey stared at her, his lips curling slightly into what could only be described as a mockery of a smile. "You think you understand me?" he said, his voice rasping as though he hadn't spoken in weeks. "You don't. None of you do." "Then help me understand," Simmons replied, leaning forward just enough to let him know she wasn't backing down. For a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the vent above. Jeffrey's gaze shifted to the ceiling, his hands motionless in the cuffs that bound him to the table, and then, as if flipping a switch in his mind, he began to speak. "They deserved it," he murmured, his voice laced with venom. "Every single one of them. You sit there and think I'm some kind of monster, some freak who snapped one day, but I didn't just wake up and decide to do this. No, they made me do it, all of them, friends, family, employees, people who got in my way, people who destroyed me." Simmons kept her face neutral, though inside she felt the weight of his words. This wasn't going to be a confession dripping with regret or remorse. It was going to be something far darker, something that stemmed from years of carefully cultivated hatred. "Go on," she urged. "What did they do to you?" Jeffrey's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening like stone. "They turned on me," he hissed. "They took everything. My business, my reputation, my family. Alan Fisher? He was one of the first. Thought he could sue me and ruin what I'd built. He had the nerve to take me to court for what? A paycheck? He didn't deserve that money. He didn't deserve anything. You found Fisher, didn't you? Out there, in that warehouse." Simmons didn't answer directly. "Alan Fisher," she repeated, writing his name in her notebook deliberately, letting Jeffrey's own mind build the tension. "Let's talk about the others. What about Mary Green?" For the first time, Jeffrey hesitated. His lips twitched and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mary," he said, dragging the name out as though tasting it. "Mary was different." "In what way?" Simmons asked, her tone sharp. "She didn't belong in this," Jeffrey muttered, his voice soft but edged with anger. "But she got in the way. She reminded me of her daughter, always looking down her nose at me like she was better than I was, snapping her fingers, demanding things. You think people like that can just get away with it, acting like they're untouchable? No, she wasn't innocent." Simmons's grip on her pen tightened, though she managed to keep her voice steady. "So, What do you call a 2-year-old grandson, Jeffrey? Was he in your way too? Jeffrey's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing into slits. That wasn't supposed to happen, he hissed, his composure cracking for just a brief moment. The boy, he was there, okay? He was there, and the situation, it just got out of control, that's all. It wasn't about him. It was never about him. Out of control? Simmons pushed, her voice rising slightly. It didn't look out of control, Jeffrey. It looked planned, premeditated. You don't leave cryptic notes like trust no one or hide bloody knives unless you're carefully planning something. So, let me ask you again, why Mary? Was she truly in your way, or are you just lying to yourself? Jeffrey slammed his cuffed wrists against the table, the metallic clang echoing through the small room. She was a reminder, he shouted, his voice cracking with equal parts rage and despair. A reminder of everything I'd lost, her kindness, her pity. It wasn't real, it was a mask. They always smile at you, but behind their backs they talk, they judge, they scheme. I wasn't going to let her win. Simmons let his outburst hang in the air for a moment before she spoke again. You keep talking about them, Jeffrey. The people who betrayed you, the people who made you do this. Is that what the chalkboard in your warehouse was about? Keeping track of your vendetta? Deciding who would be next? Jeffrey's lips parted into a wolfish grin. My masterpiece, he whispered. You found it, didn't you? Every name had a reason. They earned their place on that list. A traitor here, a thief there, each one of them a piece of the puzzle. And what did Mary Green do exactly? Simmons pressed, the weight in her voice unmistakable. She didn't respect me, Jeffrey snapped, his voice suddenly defensive. That's enough. Don't you get it? It was about respect. None of them respected me. The room fell silent again as Jeffrey lowered his head, his breathing sharp and ragged. In that moment, he almost seemed human, though Simmons knew better. His words had spilled over with twisted logic and delusion, an attempt to rewrite reality into something that justified the bodies he had left buried across state lines. Tell me about the others, Simmons said after a long pause. How many more are there, Jeffrey? How many more people need closure? Jeffrey tilted his head back and let out a low chuckle. Oh, detective, he said, his tone taunting, you'll find them eventually. You're smart. You'll piece it all together. But the thing is, you'll never understand why I did it. Not really. Because you live in a world of rules, laws, boxes, but He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. I live outside your rules. I made my own and I followed them. Simmons held his gaze, refusing to let him win the battle of wills. And that's why you're here now, Jeffrey, she said coldly. Because even your rules couldn't keep you from the truth. The truth is, you're just a scared, desperate man trying to matter in a world that left you behind. For a brief second, Jeffrey's composure faltered, and Simmons saw it, the emptiness beneath the bluster, the cracks in the facade of a man who had tried so hard to justify his madness. He leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly, though his voice remained defiant. I didn't lose, detective, he muttered, staring at the ceiling again. They did. By the time the interrogation ended, Simmons felt the weight of what had been revealed pressing heavily on her chest. The families of Jeffrey's victims now had answers, grotesque as they were, but there was no triumph here, no satisfaction. There were only shattered lives and the echoes of a man's monstrous delusions, delusions that had left scars on everyone he touched. For Simmons, it wasn't just about closing the case anymore. It was about ensuring no one would ever forget the darkness Jeffrey Miller had wrought. The fair verdict. After an exhaustive 11 months of investigation, interviews, evidence gathering, and emotional turmoil, the trial of Jeffrey Miller began. By that point, his case had become a national spectacle. News outlets from across the country had camped just outside the Westfield courthouse, their cameras capturing every movement of lawyers, law enforcement officers, and the families of victims who filed solemnly into the building. This wasn't just a trial about one man. It was about justice for lives lost, lives disrupted, and a community scarred forever. The courtroom itself brimmed with an uneasy, electric tension. On one side sat rows of grieving families, mothers, spouses, and children clutching photographs of those they had lost. Their faces bore exhaustion, not just from the months of waiting, but from the weight of stories that the public now knew all too well. Shallow graves, cryptic chalkboard lists, and the blood-soaked legacy Jeffrey Miller had left behind. On the other side sat Jeffrey himself, flanked by his defense attorneys. Though thinner and gaunter than his mugshot from almost a year ago, his hollow-eyed stare never wavered. He watched the room not with fear, but with the cold, calculating composure of someone who still believed he was in control. Prosecutors likened Jeffrey to a cunning predator, methodically laying out the extent of his crimes. Over several weeks, they presented a mountain of evidence. Photographs of the warehouse graves sent chills through the courtroom. Crime scene investigators testified about the chilling detail of the murder weapons and Jeffrey's unsettling logbook, which acted as both a confession and a hit list. They brought forward neighbors who had heard Jeffrey and Mary Green arguing in the weeks before the murders. They revealed the intricate patterns connecting Jeffrey to the victims, former employees at Joseph Miller Construction, clients who had demanded refunds, people he labeled as traitors for what he perceived to be their betrayal. But perhaps the most damning evidence came in the form of the emotionally harrowing testimonies of surviving family members. One by one, they took the stand. Alan Fisher's wife described years of anguish and unanswered questions, followed by the devastating confirmation of his body in one of Jeffrey's hidden graves. A former co-worker tearfully recounted how Alan had feared retaliation after suing Jeffrey for unpaid wages, only to vanish a few months later. Mary Green's brother told the court of her warm, generous nature and her unthinkable fate, murdered alongside her young grandson. At one point, the court was shown footage of Jeffrey's interrogation. Clips of his unnerving confession, his voice dripping with malice, his cold recounting of his rationale, stirred uncomfortable murmurs across the room. It was as though Jeffrey himself had become more than a person. He had become a living symbol of fear and violence to everyone watching. Throughout the trial, Jeffrey remained disturbingly composed. Even when the evidence piled against him, even when family members confronted him in their tearful victim statements, he rarely reacted. No apologies, no visible remorse. His attorneys argued insanity, claiming that Jeffrey's years of failure, isolation, and untreated paranoia had driven him to commit unspeakable acts. Psychologists were brought in to testify that Jeffrey suffered from severe mental illness, his warped worldview distorting his perception of reality. But the arguments fell flat in the eyes of the jury. How could mental illness justify methodical murders? How could it excuse the chilling precision of his logbook, or the years of calculated cover-ups? "This wasn't the work of a broken man," the lead prosecutor said in her closing arguments, her voice filled with quiet fury. "This was the work of a man who enjoyed his power, who took life after life without mercy, and who believed he could bend the world to his will by burying his sins in shallow graves. He deserves no less than full accountability." When the defense rested its case, Detective Rachel Simmons sat quietly in the back row of the gallery. She had spent months unraveling Jeffrey Miller's twisted motives, endless days piecing together the fragments of his victims' stories. Being here, in this room, seeing the families who had relied on her to bring justice, it was bittersweet. Nothing would bring back what they had lost. Nothing could undo the horrors she had uncovered. But she hoped this trial, this moment, would bring some semblance of peace. The jury deliberated for just under 9 hours. When they returned, the room fell silent, the only sound an audible intake of collective breath as the verdict was read. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The words hung in the room for a moment of stillness before exhaled sobs of relief echoed from the victims' families. There wasn't jubilation, no cheering, just the release of nearly a year of held-back grief, as though those two simple syllables, guilty, carried the weight of lives too soon lost. Jeffrey sat emotionless, as if the verdict didn't belong to him. Even as the judge handed down the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, he barely blinked. Simmons suspected he had prepared himself for this moment long before. The days that followed were a mix of reflection and recovery for Westfield. The media swarmed the courthouse steps, waiting for quotes from lawyers, detectives, and grieving families as they left. Some, like Mary Green's brother, said they believed justice had been served. "He'll never see the light of day again," he told reporters, "and that's what matters." Others admitted the sentence, though deserved, offered little solace. "Life without parole won't bring back my husband," said Alan Fisher's widow, clutching his photograph tightly. "But at least tonight, I'll sleep knowing no one else will ever suffer because of Jeffrey Miller." Back in prison, Jeffrey was led to solitary confinement, a man who had committed irreparable harm, now trapped with his own warped mind. For the families and community he left shattered, the scars of his crimes would run deep long after his name faded from headlines. For Detective Simmons, the case had pushed her further than any other in her career. Long nights spent poring over evidence, months of sleepless drives connecting dots across state lines, and the unrelenting weight of facing a man so broken he had transformed his failures into a license to kill. But as Simmons drove past signs welcoming her back into Westfield, a surprising sense of calm settled over her. Justice, however imperfect, had been served. This wasn't just a victory for the Green family or the Fishers or the countless others whose names were tied to Jeffrey Miller's long shadow. It was a victory for truth, for not allowing one man's darkness to remain buried in the earth, hidden forever. And as the town slowly began to rebuild its sense of safety, Simmons knew one thing for certain: Jeffrey Miller would remain behind bars for the rest of his life, a defeated shadow of the terror he once had been. Detective Simmons later reflected on everything that had unfolded, her thoughts a mix of relief and lingering sadness. The families would heal, slowly and unevenly. The town would recover, though emptier in some places where the lives lost had left gaps. And as she looked at her stack of case files one evening, she vowed to never forget what she had learned from the Jeffrey Miller case. Sometimes, the worst monsters aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones walking beside us, waiting for their moment to strike. A wake-up call. The case of Jeffrey Miller left scars that went far beyond the lives he directly touched. It wasn't just the victims' families who bore the weight of grief, it was entire towns, communities, and even the police departments tasked with solving the crime. Westfield, once the embodiment of small-town tranquility, was now a symbol of how delicate that serenity could be. Yet, out of the dark shadow that Jeffrey Miller had cast, there emerged an undeniable truth. This was more than just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. For Detective Rachel Simmons, who had worked tirelessly to bring Jeffrey Miller to justice, the aftermath of the case became a time for reflection. In quieter moments, she would sit at her desk and replay the events in her mind. How did a man like Jeffrey Miller, someone who could have stayed anonymous in the soft folds of a quiet life, transform into an unrepentant killer who struck fear into an entire region? His story didn't just raise questions about the fragility of the human psyche, it highlighted cracks in the systems designed to protect people before it was too late. Jeffrey's spiral into darkness hadn't been instantaneous. The signs had been there: shouts of distrust from neighbors, lawsuits over unpaid wages, erratic behavior on construction sites. His community had seen him grow increasingly paranoid and angry over the years. He had lost a business, a marriage, and eventually any sense of purpose. To Simmons, one point burned bright. This man was someone who had fallen through the cracks well before he became the monster who left shallow graves in forgotten fields. "This isn't just about Jeffrey Miller," Simmons said to her colleagues during a debriefing weeks after the trial. "It's about the systems that failed: mental health support, neighborly attention, even law enforcement missing early warning signs." Her words hung heavy in the room, not as an accusation but as an uncomfortable truth they couldn't ignore. Small-town life wasn't supposed to breed killers, was it? Yet the Jeffrey Miller case exposed how isolation and unchecked violence could fester even in the tightest-knit communities. Many residents had assumed problems like these belonged to the big cities or distant news headlines. Westfield believed in the safety of familiarity, in the invisibility of anonymous routines. They didn't believe someone like Jeffrey Miller could emerge from their midst. Over time, Miller's wake-up call, as the local papers began to call it, prompted a deeper look at how communities engaged with one another. For all of Westfield's quiet friendliness, the town had grown apart in subtle ways that didn't become obvious until someone like Jeffrey emerged. People kept their heads down, they ignored strange noises in the night, they dismissed the eccentric neighbor as just Jeffrey being Jeffrey. When Jeffrey failed in business, spiraled into paranoia, and disappeared into the fringes of society, no one intervened, not even when it became clear he was deeply unwell. His anger was allowed to simmer and boil over unchecked. How many others out there are like Jeffrey Miller? Simmons wondered aloud in an interview with a local journalist. Maybe not killers, but people tipping on a dangerous edge. We wait until the tipping happens, but if we can step in sooner, maybe we can prevent a tragedy instead of reacting after the fact. The alarming truth was that Jeffrey Miller wasn't some supernatural figure or horror movie villain. He was human, a product of his environment, his choices, and his unraveling mind. And while his actions were squarely his own responsibility, his story reminded everyone of how easily these horrors could breed in the shadows of neglect and indifference. In response to the case, local officials launched new community programs meant to bridge the gaps that had allowed Jeffrey to slip so easily into darkness. Townships around Westfield brought in mental health counselors, starting initiatives to check in on individuals displaying erratic or troubling behaviors before things could spiral. Public forums discussed spotting the signs of paranoia, isolation, rage, so that communities could act as a safety net before it was too late. Schools brought in criminal psychologists to lecture on mental health awareness and how untreated mental issues could lead to tragic outcomes. Business owners across Vermont and neighboring states started evaluating the relationships they had with clients and employees, ensuring disputes wouldn't turn into long-held feuds. Police departments revamped their neighborhood outreach programs, urging officers not to overlook even the smallest complaints, realizing how seemingly trivial incidents could be early warnings of deeply rooted issues. Westfield, in particular, took the hardest look inward. Town meetings became lively conversations about their shared responsibility for one another. "We turned away because it was easier," one resident confessed at a gathering. "Easier to think what Jeffrey was going through wasn't our problem. But maybe it was our problem, even if we didn't want to see it." It was a hard realization for many who had called the man a neighbor for years. Yet it forced them to reconsider what community actually meant, not just sharing the same postal code but truly knowing, trusting, and supporting one another. Despite all the progress, Simmons knew that rebuilding a culture of awareness and action wouldn't be enough to erase what Jeffrey Miller had done. Even if his crimes became a distant memory, the scars he left behind were permanent. Mothers still sat at kitchen tables with empty chairs where sons should have been. Abandoned toys and half-finished projects became tragic souvenirs of lives cut short, and Simmons herself carried her own share of invisible wounds, the haunting images she couldn't forget, the interrogation room confessions that replayed in her sleep. Miller didn't just take lives, Simmons told a group of rookie detectives at an officer training session months later. He robbed people of peace of mind, peace in their families, peace in their communities. That's why this has to stick, not just his name, not just his trial, but the lessons we should take from what happened here. For Simmons, the case of Jeffrey Miller would forever stand as a reminder that even the quietest places weren't immune to the cracks of neglect and blind assumptions. Isolation could breed silence, and silence could be deadly. The question wasn't whether a Jeffrey Miller could emerge somewhere else, it was what could be done to stop it before it happened again. "I think about Mary Green often," Simmons admitted in a rare personal interview months later. "She tried to be kind even to him, but kindness wasn't enough, not when his mind was already so far gone. What could we have done differently?" That's the thought I live with. Slowly Westfield began to heal, though it would never quite return to its once postcard-perfect innocence. The Jeffrey Miller case became a ghost story and a cautionary tale for neighboring towns, one that parents shared with their children and that schools studied to remind young minds of the value of empathy, observation, and action. Simmons knew the world Jeffrey Miller had left behind would never fully forget his name, but perhaps in the years to come, remembering Jeffrey Miller wouldn't just be about his crimes, it would be about the lives that weren't